Hello, everyone, and thanks for listening to The Quality Hub, chatting with ISO experts. I'm your host, Xavier Francis, and today I'm here with Suzanne Weber-Smatko, Manager of Consulting Services here at Core Business Solutions. Glad you could join us again.
Glad to be here, X.
So glad to have you here. It's always fun. Well, this week's podcast is called Document Control in ISO, and we'll be looking how ISO 9001 handles documents. But before we begin, let's hear a little bit from Suzanne as she tells us about her experience and journey.
Well, I've been in quality for a little over 30 years. My background is aerospace. I've held various positions in quality, so lots of experience there. Long journey.
And you said, I think, 4 years here at Core?
Yes, 4 years. Right. Yeah.
That's great.
4 years. Boy, that went by quick.
I know. I'll be 6 next month.
Wow.
So, yeah, it does go by fast.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. So, again, we're talking about document control. To start us off, I'm going to read a clause from the ISO standard.
Uh-oh, you're one of those.
Well,
you're going to read it right from the standard.
I'm going to read it right from it.
All right.
This is clause 7.5.1, and it states, the organization's quality management system shall include documented information required by this international standard, documented information determined by the organization as being necessary for the effectiveness of the QMS, the size of organization and its type of activities, processes, products, and services, the complexity of processes and their interactions, and the competence of persons. And then there are other sections that are entitled creating and updating and control of documented information. So that's what we're here to talk about today. Reading that, it sounds like it's not quite as bad as reading a contract from a lawyer or something, but or like when you're closing on your house.
Sure.
But what the heck does that mean?
I guess the key thing is the words in there: effectiveness of the quality management system, controlled documents. That's the kind of documents that we're going to talk about today. Document control is a formal set of tools and or a process to ensure that vital documents, again, ones that affect your quality management system, are defined or created, reviewed, approved, controlled, distributed, and archived. And I think we're going to get into a little bit more detail on that.
So not all documents are controlled, right? Just specific ones?
Correct. It really is essential for the ISO framework to ensure employees or interested parties have access to the latest revisions of documents
that makes sense.
That are used by a company. ISO 9000 requires an organization to maintain documented information deemed necessary by them for the effectiveness of their quality management system.
It's sort of what we just read there.
Yeah, and you're going to learn a little bit more about that today if there's any confusion.
Okay. So could you walk us through the key elements of an effective document control system as per this standard, and how do we approach it here at Core? I know we've been doing this a long time. You've been doing this a long time. What are the elements and how do we approach that?
Yeah, because it can certainly get overcomplicated. There's a lot of confusion between document control and record control. What documents do I have to control? You can overcomplicate it because everybody wants to, identify everything or not enough. So the key elements of a document control system is you identify what documents need to be controlled, right? That usually includes things like procedures, checklists, job descriptions, employee handbooks. I like to use the checklists as an example, but it's documents that you don't want anybody. It's just that controlled that you don't want anybody manipulating or changing. So you control that so that it's not pure chaos.
Right.
So the first element that I would talk about is document approval. So first you define the document. Let's use an employee handbook as an example.
Okay.
Someone approves that document. If you make any changes to that document, it would require somebody to reapprove it, review the amended changes, and reapprove it. You keep a change log. You want to see the history of those changes.
Okay.
So you identify the changes.
Is that something that's usually audited?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. An auditor, internal or external, or an interested party, for that matter, will look to make sure that you're identifying the changes so that you know what the differences in the revisions are.
Right. Do you have to put in a reason why, or just that they were changed?
No, just what you changed.
Okay.
You want to make documents available where they're needed, right? I mean,
So if you're on the floor and you're making something, you need to have the most updated
that's correct.
work instructions.
Right. If you have an employee handbook, again, that's a good example. If you have an employee handbook and you're onboarding somebody, whoever's doing that onboarding needs to make sure they have the latest revision of that employee handbook, right? Because you don't want to train someone on an outdated version.
Right.
You want to control the documents of external origin and then prevent inadvertent use of obsolete documents.
So again, handbook, work instructions.
Yeah, work instructions.
Even and other things.
Yeah.
Maybe your quality manual.
Yeah, definitely. Your quality manual is a controlled document, procedures, work instructions. You don't want somebody working to an older version.
Right.
Say you had a really, really important step. You had an engineering change on something, and this is relative to a manufacturing shop floor, and you had a sequence of operations in your work order, and you needed to add a significant operation to that. And you didn't control the document and you released it to your shop floor and it wasn't updated or controlled correctly and that operation wasn't done, then you have non-conforming product.
Right.
Or could potentially have non-conforming product. That kind of falls into giving your employees the tools they need to be successful. Part of that is somebody has a role of being a document control coordinator to make sure that they only have access to the latest revisions of those things.
It's absolutely essential.
So our approach at Core is we have customers that make an inventory of what documents require control. This can get, again, people can overcomplicate this type of exercise. But if you don't have a index and you don't have a table of contents or something, how can you demonstrate that you know what documents that you control, right? So our approach here at Core, when we get into document control and implementing the processes required of the standard, we have our customers do an inventory. Let's inventory the documents that you want to control.
Okay.
Again, your work instructions, your job descriptions, your procedures, your manual, your employee handbooks, your inspection checklists, your anything that people can add data to.
Okay.
Because once you add data to it, it then becomes a record. There's a lot of confusion on.
I think we're going to talk about that.
Yeah. Sometimes you'll have people add like government documents there, such as the W-9. Well, they don't control that. The government does, right? So we'll
it's
look
not
at
necessarily
those
controlled documents, things you want to control.
Right.
So,
if it's out of your control, like a W-9, right? That's a government issued document.
Right.
There's revisions on that. You don't have control of making revisions on that.
Gotcha.
Right. So once we have the list and determine what documents we want to control, then we upload them into our software, which takes you through a cycle of reviewing, approving, and actually releasing it, so that the latest version is always there.
Do you have any, we talked about a few, but what are some of the other common documents that are controlled in most businesses?
Inspection checklists. It may be routers.
Now, you said we need to save them. You talked about Core. Go into a little more detail about what if you don't have Core? Where do you put them? How do you save them if you do have them in Core?
Well, the requirements don't change, right? We talked about the key elements when we talk about document approval and documenting updates, identifying changes and keeping a change log, making documents available. That doesn't change regardless of what system you have.
Right.
If you have a SharePoint site or you have a common drive, one thing I will say is that through my experience, there are a lot of findings relative to document control.
Okay.
Because people don't have a formalized system to document them. They want to keep them out into a shared area where multiple revisions are sometimes accessible. And one thing you don't want to be doing is fumbling around seeing multiple revisions available to people. Right. Especially when you're going through an audit or some type of review.
Well, this says revision 3. We're actually on revision 5. Oh.
Yeah, but 3 and 5 are located in this
Same
folder,
place,
right?
Yeah.
So the requirements do not change. What can be the differentiator is if you have a good software that controls it or you don't.
That's one reason we developed Core. We're going to talk about that in a future podcast coming up.
Yeah.
Why did we decide to make Core?
Yeah. Because I think that's a weakness in a lot of businesses, unless you have a software that does it. Because manually doing it doesn't allow you to, the process to be repeatable.
Right.
We talk about quality processes and them being repeatable. Yeah. So you want to make sure it could become messy really quick if somebody's manually managing that, unless you have a specific document control coordinator or something like that can focus on that.
And it might be harder than it really needs to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
How does document control contribute to maintaining consistency and quality within an organization's processes? You touched on it a little bit.
Yeah. Well, imagine everybody using their own version of documents, right? Imagine, I'll use an inspection checklist, right? You have a final inspection checklist. And usually you make that checklist for your inspector so that they know what they want to expect, right? So it has a list of characteristics on it that must be measured.
Right.
Dimensional characteristics. And they're doing their inspection and they're going to record their variable data on this inspection record.
Okay.
Well, you don't want everybody to be able to change that. That's sort of like a work instruction. Hey, I need you to check these key characteristics or these characteristics. Imagine an inspector having to build it on his own every time. It would be different every time.
Yeah.
Right? So it improves.
Well, I'll take a look here. I'll take a look there.
Yeah.
They might have something in their head, but hey, if you're having a bad day, it's really easy to skip something.
Right. So, it improves the quality process and control overall. It eliminates duplication of efforts, right? If somebody had to build it, you're giving somebody what the expectation is for inspection.
Correct.
And it keeps employees on the same page.
So maybe somebody's on vacation, somebody else is doing inspections.
Absolutely. Yeah.
They know exactly what to do.
Yeah. And I think that comes along with the next point that I would make is it sort of streamlines the training process. When you are consistent and repeatable and you have a fixed document or a controlled document, it makes it easier for training someone, right? Imagine that chaos of not having a controlled document or a controlled inspection checklist.
Right.
Well, your new employee is going to get out there and he may not be the inspector, but he may be looking at this checklist going, oh, what do I need to do?
Yeah. What does this mean?
Streamlines the training process. It just overall makes everything repeatable. And that's what you want. You want consistency, repeatability, a standardized process.
Yep. So how do you ensure accessibility and availability of documents while maintaining security and confidentiality in a document control system? I know we talked a little bit about CORE, and that's, again, one reason we built it.
Let's see. Ensuring accessibility and availability of documents. You want to make sure that the people that need to have access to them have access to them, right? You don't want to keep them in a vacuum somewhere where they can't get it and have to rely on somebody else. So, and you can control that by access rights. And you should control that by access rights. Not everybody should have access to your original controlled document.
Okay. So permissions perhaps and something.
Yeah. And it's a requirement of the standard to make sure that the documents are available to all people. Security and confidentiality is another thing, right? Especially at this day and age with security issues. But again, having the right controls in place in terms of access rights. And perhaps I've seen in my past life where we actually educated people on the confidentiality of our documents because, some of that stuff is proprietary.
Yeah.
I would always advise or recommend that everyone in the organization, not everyone has to know the standard, but everyone in the organization should understand document control. We often get in trouble when it comes to document control on our shop floors too, because people like to make out their own work instructions and, pin them up on the wall or their own notes and on Post-its. And, I will tell you that I've seen that result in a finding. You know what I mean? So
it's not documented properly. It's not bad to have
controlled,
notes.
Right?
Yeah, it's not controlled, but it should be as part of the work instruction that everybody sees, not just on Joe's station.
Sure. Or make sure it's identified as a reference document or something like that not a controlled,
right. Yeah. And then it goes back to CORE where a lot of these things, again, not to sound like a commercial, but one of the reasons that we developed CORE was we saw some of these difficulties in document and control and said, how can we manage that?
Yeah.
That's best for our customers.
Yeah.
And we just developed that software.
That and non-conforming material, I think, historically has been, the handling of non-conformant material. I know, over 10 years ago, you used to see findings on that all the time. That was always a problem area.
All right. Well, what are common challenges? We talked a little bit about where do you keep them and how do you control them? But what are some common challenges that companies face when implementing document control under ISO 9001, and how can we overcome these?
Some common challenges that people face are, again, not understanding the difference on what needs to be controlled and what doesn't need to be controlled. Just keep in mind that if If you walked me through your operations process and I'm going to see the document being used, that impacts your quality management system, right? They need to be controlled. I like to kind of simplify it for people to say, listen, if I'm going to see it, if it's a document that you're using, if it's covered by a clause in the standard and I'm going to see it throughout your operation, it should be controlled, right? If you have a supplier qualification or supplier evaluation form, it should be controlled.
Correct.
So some of the challenges are really, what do I need to control and what don't I need to control?
Okay.
We're not looking to control finance documents. We're not looking to control HR documents unless there are maybe job descriptions. That's the biggest challenge that I see, is people trying to differentiate what needs to be controlled, what doesn't need to be controlled, because you can't control every single document in your organization. So always keep in mind, if it affects your quality management system or is included in your quality management system, then it should be controlled.
Okay. A lot of people might consider, in this day and age specifically, thinking about security versus a controlled document. So they're not the same thing. Like if you're talking HR, just because you want that to be secured so somebody can't have access to personal records and stuff like that, doesn't mean it's a controlled document from an ISO standard perspective.
That's correct.
This ends part 1 of our podcast with Suzanne Weber-Smatko on document control and ISO. Please tune in next week where you can hear part 2 of this podcast. And we'd like to thank everyone who's listened to our podcast today. We hope it's been informative for you. If you're looking for more information about Core Business Solutions and how we can help you with ISO certification, cybersecurity, or even customized training, please email us at info@thecoresolution.com. You can also visit our website at www.thecoresolution.com. And if you haven't already followed us on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube, be sure to do so. That way you won't miss the next Quality Hub podcast when it's released next week. Have a great day, everyone.